Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Substack. In today's video, what I want to do is a deep dive into the influence of lifetime exercise on pelvic organ prolapse. For those who are newer to the pelvic space, pelvic organ prolapse is a change in range of motion of one or more of the vaginal walls on a max bear down. When you tell a person to push down into their pelvis, pelvic floor should be relaxed. And you are looking at the amount of movement of those vaginal walls and what that movement endpoint is relative to the opening of the vagina. Now, there has been a lot of change in our thoughts and feelings around pelvic organ prolapse. That is a rant for another day. But what is important for us to consider is that number one, that there should be movement of the vaginal walls. It is not a cartilaginous ring. Our vaginal walls touch, they move, they shift with time of day and gravity, which leads into my second point, which is that we expect a change or increase to vaginal range of motion and resting position of our pelvic organs as individuals get older and as they have accumulated a change in obstetrical history, meaning that they have been pregnant and in particular had vaginal deliveries, seems to be a risk factor or lead to expected changes of an increase in that vaginal wall range of motion. When it comes to the influence of exercise, this is a hotly debated topic because the idea is that with impact and strenuous exercise, that there is an acceleration to those changes in vaginal wall range of motion, which asks the question, is exercise good or bad for the pelvic floor? And we have often talked about this in snapshots in time, mostly around pregnancy and postpartum. But now some of the conversation is linking to what do we know about exercise as individuals get into their 50s, postmenopause, 60s, 70s, and beyond. This is a very nuanced topic, one where we are starting to gain a little bit more insight, but I really hesitate to make sweeping statements because there's a lot of nuance and contextualization that is required when having these types of conversations. The first study that I want to speak to is this study that was done out of the UK that was looking at accelerometer-based data in a large prospective cohort study. What they showed was that, and I'm going to share my screen here so you can take a look, and I'm going to be going back and forth, so I'm going to see how well I do with sharing my screen over and over again. But what they were able to show here, if I go down to this screen, when we go down here and we look at their conclusion statements, what they showed, and this is a little bit complicated, so maybe I'm just going to go into the conclusions, was that moderate to vigorous physical activity actually did not increase the likelihood of pelvic organ prolapse, but light physical activity did, which meant that the amount of time that people spend on their feet, which probably isn't as much a consequence of exercise, but rather their occupation, their care needs, their day-to-day, what that looks like, was a bigger risk factor. And we see that gravity works on the pelvis, right? We end up with wrinkles on the inside of our body, just like we have wrinkles on the outside, where gravity can sometimes be nobody's friend. And the longer we're spending on our feet with gravity acting on our pelvic floor, you compound that and times that by decades of life. Yes, we're going to expect some changes to that vaginal wall range of motion. The conclusion statement here, though, was mortifying, where it said that we should substitute light physical activity with sedentary behavior to lower the risk of pelvic organ prolapse. Now, this is mortifying because we do not have a movement problem, right? We do not have a culture of older adults who are too active. We have a lack of movement problem. And sedentary behavior has been linked to almost 20 different chronic diseases. Pelvic organ prolapse, while uncomfortable and influential in a person's quality of life and their body image, etc., is not life-threatening. Chronic disease is. And so we want to be very careful, again, to contextualize and nuance this conversation and compare that to expected changes. Now, when we look at some of Janet Shaw's work and we take a look at her evaluation of lifetime physical activity, she draws a pretty similar conclusion in that when we look at lifetime physical activity and pelvic organ prolapse, there doesn't seem to be this relationship. However, she does highlight that strenuous activity in younger life may be a risk factor for pelvic organ prolapse later on. Now, I think this is again where nuance and context is extremely important. What we know is that when individuals are pushing the realm of their fitness, when we're thinking about athletic endeavors, there is a moment where the health continuum of this flips. Nobody would say that our really highly active individuals are optimizing health, they are optimizing performance. And we see that those who participate in high impact sport do have downstream consequences of earlier life decisions, where, for example, people who played football or hockey, concussion history, and CTE neurological conditions. We see individuals with running related injuries are more likely to have arthritis in that joint down the line. And when you ask these athletes if they would change anything about their earlier life in their athletic pursuits, they would probably say no. It's important that we understand these relationships, but this is to kind of highlight that what you do across your lifespan is going to show in signs and symptoms across your body, battle scars, wrinkles, changes to joint position, etc. And we just want to know those risk factors, and maybe that is something that we ask about. Trying to discourage women from exercise is not the play. And when we look at some of our newer data, and we specifically go to some of our new data that is looking at our over 75 population, what we know is that clinically relevant amounts of muscular weakness does not help the pelvic floor. When I teach in geriatrics, we talk about a concept called 1 rep max living. This is when the demands of your life are at or exceeding your 1 rep max, meaning that you are providing a lot of effort to complete ADLs. And with that, what happens is that everything that you do during your day becomes a high strain task. High strain on the pelvis is a potential risk factor for pelvic organ prolapse, and our evidence is now starting to substantiate that, where sarcopenia, 1 rep max living, clinically relevant amounts of muscular weakness, is now being seen as a predictor for higher degrees of vaginal range of motion change or pelvic organ prolapse in older women. And so we need to always have a very nuanced and balanced conversation when it comes to these types of issues, because we don't want to scare women into not exercising when we know that, especially as individuals get older, their exercise sharply declines and strength around the pelvis is protective. What this means is that this type of conversation requires a lot of care and requires a lot of nuance and contextualization, as I've mentioned, in order for us to have a true picture of the influence of physical activity on the pelvis across the lifespan. It is so easy to think or place blame on returning to exercise too early postpartum, or the way that you exercise when you were younger on your experiences of aging. But what we know is that ultimately our aging experience is a health report card. And that includes everything. It includes our abdominal adipose tissue changes or changes in weight. It is our stress management. It is our family history. It is our environment. It is our climate. It is our exercise history. It is our nutrition. And it's the influence of nature and nurture over many years that are going to predict how individuals age. When it comes to pelvic organ prolapse, I have a lot of conversation with my clients in their 60s and 70s around management. And what we have to acknowledge is that, again, pelvic organ prolapse is not life-threatening, and getting individuals engaging in lifelong physical activity, even if it causes changes in vaginal wall range of motion, is still a very important goal. And if they love exercising at high intensity and high impact, may they have higher range of motion in their vaginal walls when they're 70? Yes. But does that mean that we discourage that? Absolutely not. So I hope you all found this interesting. Again, I'm at this 10-minute mark. Let me know if you have any other thoughts or questions, and I look forward to the next video.